61 AD, the western edge of the Roman Empire. I'm Matthew Settle. Here a warrior queen rose in revolt. Her name was Boudica. She united the British tribes against Rome, sacking cities and spreading panic and destruction wherever she went. The Roman governor at the time, Paulinus, scraped together 10,000 men in a final attempt to crush her here, on the main Roman road, Watling Street. This battle would decide the fate of Britain and test the bounds of Roman conquest. Now, with new video game technology, you're about to see this great battle as never before. The vast numbers of soldiers, the troop formations, how they fought, and how the battle was won. You get the view the generals wished they'd had. Now, on decisive battles. Britain was a prosperous Roman province in the 1st century AD. It was rich in mineral deposits and natural resources. But Britain did not give over easily to Roman rule. No less a figure than Julius Caesar had tried and failed to conquer Britain over a century before. Rome successfully invaded Britain in 43 AD. But it took several more years to pacify the various tribes that populated the region. Even though they had been conquered, pockets of fierce resistance remained. Britain was far from being a settled Roman province.
This is a place where military reputations full stop, can be won or lost. One has to remember that Britain is a late entry to the empire. Here fortunes, military and financial, can be made.
In Britain, the Romans ruled over a patchwork of tribal kingdoms. In the north were the Brigantes, in the south, the Belgae and Regni, and in the east were the Iceni. These British tribes lived in villages just like this one, reconstructed in southern England. Boudica was the widow of Prasutagus, a chief of the Iceni. He saw that security depended on a peaceful relationship with the Romans. Since Prasutagus didn't have a son when he died, he left his lands to be jointly controlled by his wife Boudica and the Roman Emperor Nero.
And so we have a situation where Prasutagus actually makes the Emperor Nero his heir, or part heir. And the idea, I think, behind what Prasutagus is doing is to ensure a favourable, friendly relationship between Rome and the Iceni.
But Rome wasn't deterred. The Roman Emperor Nero had nothing but contempt for the wife and daughters left behind by Prasutagus.
They came in, they took over, and when she objected, as naturally she did do, she was flogged and the girls were raped.
But Rome underestimated Boudica. When she and her daughters escaped, they went back and raised an army. The brutal treatment of the queen and her daughters would be avenged. News of what happened spread like wildfire. Boudica's own tribe, the Iceni, joined forces with the neighboring Trinovantes so they could teach Rome a lesson. Ancient histories claimed that her army numbered more than 100,000. And, like most Iceni women, she was not afraid of a fight.
I suppose today she has special significance because she was, after all, a woman. Celtic society were rather big on women. Roman society was not like that at all.
Roman writers make a lot of the fact that this rebellion is led by a woman. The Romans emphasise this very strongly in their accounts, and they regard Boudica as this very, very strange, sinister figure. Something rather unnatural, really.
The Iceni fought with a variety of weapons: spears, swords, and axes. Many smeared woad, a primitive blue dye, over their faces, and sometimes their entire bodies.
We know that the Celtic warriors traditionally fought without clothes on at all. I don't think that was necessarily true at this period. I expect they will have had trousers, and you also know that they had great big moustaches. And one Roman writer, a man called Diodorus Siculus, says that when the Celtic warriors drank their soup, these moustaches acted as a sort of filter.
Boudica now had an army of almost 30,000 men and women. She attacked the town of Camulodunum and utterly destroyed it.
We are given details of the deaths of those people who were put to the sword and tortured by the rebels. The Roman historians talk about them being tortured, impaled on sharpened stakes, all sorts of really horrible details.
The Romans were taken completely by surprise. They hastily threw together a small army, but this force, not even properly armed, was soon swept aside.
We're dealing with southern England, we're dealing with, if you like, the soft underbelly of the emergent Roman territory. It's an area which has less troops in at this particular moment in time.
Rome had a full-scale war on its hands. The 9th Legion, of around 4,000 men, led by Cerealis, was sent against the rebels. This was a crack fighting force. But the Britons defeated the 9th so completely that Cerealis was forced to flee to Gaul to save his own skin.
Cerealis was rash, he advanced without scouts, he was caught with his pants down.
The governor of Britain, Suetonius Paulinus, realized he had a real problem on his hands. He had been warring on the island of Anglesey. Now, he had to march the 14th Legion back 200 miles from the west coast to deal with this rebellion in his front yard.
In an ideal world, he'd wait, he'd get more troops together before confronting her. So there's a little bit of manoeuvring that has to go on first. Troops need to be called in. He needs to get to somewhere where he can operate against Boudica.
Paulinus hurried to Londinium, present-day London. But he had too few men at his disposal. He did not want to end up like Cerealis and rush into battle only to be defeated. He needed time to build up an army. He decided to do the unthinkable and abandon London. The people of London begged him for help, but Paulinus ignored their pleas and left them to the mercy of the Britons. He needed time to raise up an army and devise a battle plan. His 14th Legion were all experienced veterans, but even counting their auxiliaries, they numbered only 6,000 men. Boudica's troops surged into the city. They slaughtered Roman civilians and Britons alike, and after a day-long rampage, sacked the city.
The Boudica rebellion was very serious. It was bad news for Rome. And quite apart from anything else, 80,000 people who were friendly to Rome, and including Romans themselves, were massacred by the rebels right at the beginning of the revolt. So it was really bad news, and there was even a possibility that the Romans might have been thrown out of Britain, and that would have been a disaster for Roman prestige.
In one day, Boudica had destroyed the center of Roman influence in Britain. Now the Romans had to stop her, or they would lose Britain altogether. 61 AD. Boudica, Britain's warrior queen, is fighting to end the Roman occupation of Britain. The Roman general Paulinus ordered his army to march east. But while they were still on the move, Boudica sacked Verulamium. The warrior queen seemed unstoppable. Now she turned north along the main Roman road, Watling Street.
Boudica moves pretty swiftly, almost along the lines of Roman communication. The roads that had been an instrument of Roman domination become something that actually helps her accelerate through this young province.
Paulinus had gathered more troops, including several hundred cavalry. But his 10,000 men were still greatly outnumbered, and they were tired from the long march. Paulinus expected the 2nd Legion to come to his aid, but the general in charge, Postumius, thought this was a suicide mission and refused.
It may be that he was just too frightened. He realised that the crunch had come, and he perhaps thought that the Boudica's warriors would totally overwhelm Paulinus, and he wasn't going to be caught in that disaster too.
Postumius' fears were well grounded. The Romans faced a force of at least 30,000 Britons. They were well supplied and supported by a huge baggage train. The scene was set for an epic clash as Paulinus marched out his weary veterans to face Boudica's baying horde. The Romans marched along Watling Street to meet them. Watling Street was the major Roman road north through Britain. Road building was a vital part of the Roman occupation. With good straight roads, they could move troops quickly around the country. Paulinus was an experienced commander. He knew he had to fight Boudica's forces on a battlefield that canceled out her greatest strength, her superior numbers. So he decided to fight here, just south of Watling Street, 100 miles north of London.
He had one advantage, and one big advantage, and that is he could choose the actual battle site. He knew that he would be totally outnumbered by the rebels, who at this stage are supposed to have numbered something between a quarter and a third of 1,000,000 men. I mean, a huge, huge force.
Paulinus wanted to give Boudica little room to maneuver. So he chose a battlefield which had thick woods on either side. This field was broad at one end, but narrow at the other. Paulinus placed his army at the point where the field narrowed. Boudica lined up her troops directly opposite, where the land broadened out. The ground also curved up where it met the woods. This protected the Roman army's flanks. To Boudica and her British warriors, it must have looked like easy pickings. Here were the Romans outnumbered at least 3-1, deliberately drawing themselves up in a place that offered no retreat. The Britons could simply press in and hack away till the last legionary fell.
The Romans, after all, seem to be on the back foot. They've been hit badly. 3 towns have been pulverised. The 9th Legion mauled in an ambush.
Boudica's forces were so confident of victory, they brought along their women and children to watch the action from a huge wagon crescent drawn up behind the battlefield.
They were on the up. They had been tremendously successful. This was like, a tremendous event which everybody was supporting. The whole family was there, and to cheer on the victors as they saw it.
The Roman historian Tacitus, writing less than 50 years afterwards, put speeches in the mouths of both commanders, hatred seething from their lips. He writes that before the battle, Paulinus told his men, "Despise the savage uproar, the yells and shouts of undisciplined barbarians. In that mixed multitude, the women outnumber the men." Meanwhile, across the battlefield, Boudica rallied her forces. From the pride and arrogance of the Romans, nothing is sacred. All are subject to violation. The old endure the scourge, and the virgins are deflowered. This would be the decisive battle of the campaign. Either Rome would win, or Boudica would get her revenge and take back Britain. The Britons made the first move, and with an almighty roar, the horde took up their weapons and charged at the Romans. The very first battle of Britain had begun. This time, the Romans knew what they were facing. They would not crack under the British assault, as the men of the 9th Legion had done. Now they would do what they did best: hold their nerve, be disciplined, and follow their drill to the letter. When the British came within 40 yards, the legionaries flung a volley of pila into the front ranks. These light spears were specifically designed to disrupt the charge of cavalry or infantry. The heavy metal heads lodged in the shields and weighed down the front ranks. The aim was to kill the enemy or trip them up. Since many of the Britons were lightly armed or even naked, this organized volley was devastating. Unluckily for them, Roman legionaries always carried 2 pila. Another organized volley turned the howling charge into a screaming slaughter. But still the Britons surged forward. Till now they had beaten every army the Romans had sent against them and destroyed their greatest city. They were determined to win this final battle. Boudica, Queen of the Iceni, is fighting to end the Roman occupation of Britain. The Britons sent in wave after wave of warriors. Boudica watched the battle from her chariot. She could see this was a very different Roman force from the 9th Legion that she had smashed earlier in the year.
It's an army that's used to fighting, very experienced, and under a very capable commander.
These Romans had picked a good spot for battle. They were standing their ground. Her favorite technique of intimidating the enemy was not working against this veteran army. Her army was much larger, but it was being funneled into the narrow end of the battlefield. She could not outflank the Romans.
All of the evidence appears to be that she was an extremely capable woman, a fighter, and she would have been in the battle and probably would have been in the thick of things.
The discipline of the legions stopped the British charge in its tracks. Now Paulinus ordered the Roman troops forward.
Fairly familiar Roman shock tactics. You lead with the javelin, and then as the enemy is approaching you, slowed down almost to a walk, you run straight into them. You hit them very hard.
At the same time, the Roman cavalry plowed into the disorganized horde. There was chaos in the ranks.
The Britons would have had much longer swords, and they would have really needed space to use these to effect. They had absolutely fantastic courage, but really they couldn't deploy, they couldn't utilize their courage, they couldn't utilize the fighting tactics for which they were best suited. Everything was on the side of the Romans.
In the press of battle, with no proper leadership to drive them on, many Britons decided to cut and run, and live to fight another day. But now their earlier arrogance was working against them. Their huge baggage train blocked the way. The Britons had cut off their line of retreat with their own wagons. Now the wives and children of Britons, so confident of victory, found themselves in the middle of a massacre. Their menfolk ran from the battle toward them, only to find the spaces between the wagons had become choke points. There was no escape. They had abandoned what little battle order they had, and now they were being hacked down.
The Roman legionary fought with the gladius, the short stabbing sword, and stab upwards alongside the shield with the right hand into the stomach area of the enemy.
Bloodlust drove the Romans on. They'd come to the battlefield tired and outnumbered, and now their enemy was cornered and confused. The Romans showed no mercy.
Tacitus says that they just saw red. It was a sort of battle haze. And that having pushed the British warriors back onto their own wagon line, that they just cut down the draft animals, cut down the women and children, spared absolutely nothing.
They killed combatants and non-combatants alike. The Britons were caught between Roman steel and a barricade of their own creation, a crescent of chariots where their families had been watching, hoping to see a British victory. Now they too lay dead at the feet of the Roman troops. The death toll, though no doubt exaggerated in Rome's favor, reflects the incredible carnage done that day. It was claimed that Rome lost only 400 men to 80,000 Britons.
I think it is likely that it was so. It would be very rash to say that 80,000 is anything like an accurate number, but I think it will have run into thousands. And as for the Roman losses, I think that 400 is probably the number of people who actually perished and fell on the battlefield.
Whatever the figure, Rome had won a devastating and decisive victory. When Postumius, who had been afraid to help Paulinus, got word of the Roman victory, he was so overcome with shame that he committed suicide. Boudica raced from the battlefield. capture would have meant being dragged back to Rome in chains, torture, then execution. The Romans followed in hot pursuit. But before they could reach her, Boudica took poison and died.
There are two stories about the fate of Boudica. One is that she fell ill and died. The other is that she took poison. The simple answer is we don't know. There is an urban myth that she is buried under platform 9 at King's Cross railway station in London, but there's absolutely no evidence to support that story.
Boudica's death marks the end of effective resistance to Roman rule by the Britons. Though pockets of revolt remained, it was clear the Britons had been conquered by Rome and would remain under Roman rule for nearly 400 years.
Rome hit them very, very hard. Boudica's actual legacy for Roman Britain really was Britain really worth all this? But the answer came back quite quickly thereafter. Yes, it was.
Today, a statue of Boudica, the warrior queen, stands on the banks of the Thames. The woman who fought against the might of Rome remains an enduring symbol of defiance and a champion for her nation.